Okay. All right. Any questions about anything else coming up this week or anything? Go ahead, Annalise. Oh, thank you. Yeah, yeah. So the class on Friday is just a video that you got to watch. So that's it. Yeah, no extra assignment, no anything. I forgot to talk about that. I'm going to a conference on Friday, and so I won't be here. So yeah, so it's just a video of me going over the notes, just like I would in class. So yeah, nothing extra to do except for just watch that video, take the notes like you normally would, and that's it. Yep. Okay. All right. Anything else? Okay, so let's dive into this a little bit. We'll start out with this question here. What are the longest cells in the body?
Okay. Yeah, because those go all the way. I don't know. I've never taken a big class. You guys said, we said, hey, we're but remember there's that longest muscle fiber.
All right, so go ahead and take a guess on there. Give you about 10 more seconds. A few more of you need to send it in.
Oh my gosh, I just read my answer.
All right, anybody else? Is that everybody? I got 63. Probably about it. Okay. All right, so half of you guys are saying nerve cells or neurons, half of you are saying skeletal muscle cells. So right in the middle there. So yeah, nerves or neurons are longer than skeletal muscle cells. Skeletal muscle cells can be quite long. Muscle cells can get up to be maybe 2 to 3 feet long. Axons of nerves can sometimes be your full height, but then even longer than that because of the way that they wrap around sometimes. It can be somewhere 6 to 12 feet long at times. And that's just a single cell, right? That's just one cell that is that full length. Okay, so we'll take a look at a little bit about how the skeletal muscle cells look today. We'll spend some more time talking about neurons in the next couple of weeks once we finish up muscle and move into the nervous system. Okay. All right, so first of all, just some kind of general characteristics that we find in all types of muscle, okay? Because there's actually 3 different types of muscle in the body. Skeletal muscle is just one of those. We'll talk about all those different ones today. So the first is that this is a tissue that's excitable. What that means is it responds to stimulation, which then that means that we can control it, right? The nervous system can control it by stimulating it or not stimulating it. Okay, so it's excitable. It's also contractile, which means that we can shorten it in a forceful way, right? And this allows us to move things, carry things, exert some force on something using the power in our skeletal muscle or in our muscle, not just skeletal muscle, but all muscle. Okay, it also has extensibility, which means we can stretch it passively. Okay, this allows for some flexibility as well as increased range of motion. And then not only can we stretch it, but when we stretch it, it tries to bounce back too. And that's the elasticity part of it, right? Muscles recoil when they've been stretched. And this helps to prevent injury, but also helps to provide force too. It's kind of a free source of energy for the body. So for example, when we just when we're walking, if you look at the activity in one of our calf muscles, our gastrocnemius muscle, about 30% of the energy that that gastrocnemius muscle uses is just generated by the elasticity in the muscle, and that's helping push us along. And so just when you step down and you stretch out that calf muscle a little bit, and you start to go forward, that elasticity pushes you forward, and that's free energy, right? There's no ATP required for that. We'll talk about ATP soon, but that's our chemical energy in the body as we we eat food to make that thing for the most part, right? And so if we don't have to use that, that's more efficient for us, right? And so skeletal muscle is very efficient because it has that built-in elasticity to it. Okay, any questions about any of these four characteristics? All right, so general uses of muscle. Muscle tone is something we find in all types of muscle. Okay, so the smooth muscle inside of our arteries always has some level of contraction to it. That's kind of what tone means. It's not just completely relaxed. There's always some level of contraction to it. This is really important for maintaining our blood pressure. Okay, if all of a sudden all of our smooth muscle in our artery is just relaxed, we would collapse. Our blood pressure would plummet, and we'd hit the floor pretty quick because we wouldn't have blood in our brains anymore. Our blood pressure would be so low, right? So that tone in our smooth muscle is incredibly important. Okay, skeletal muscle has tone, which aids in joint stability. Okay, kind of keeps those bones kind of pushing against each other in somewhat of a tight way. Even when you think you're fully relaxed, the little muscles around a lot of your joints that still have a little bit of tone to them, so it's kind of helping hold your joints together. Okay, and this is also really important for posture, right? We're not thinking, you guys aren't thinking about contracting your back muscles or your neck extensor muscles right now, but you're also not completely slouched over on the table, right? You're using those muscles in a subconscious fashion because you've got some muscle tone in those muscles. Okay, and that tone really just means like a constant level of contraction, and your brain is responsible for that. It's in a subconscious fashion. It's sending signals to your muscle to keep it contracted a little bit so you can maintain the posture that you have. Okay, so then obviously movement's an important one. Important use of muscle in our smooth muscle in our arteries, movement of blood. Okay, by contracting down that smooth muscle, it's going to increase our blood pressure. It's going to make our blood move faster through our body, which is really helpful in times of stress. Right, when we need to move food through our digestive tract, our smooth muscle in our digestive tract is going to help us do that. Talk more about that next semester, but it's a series of wave-like contractions called peristalsis that contracts in this kind of nice pattern that pushes food through. Okay, and then obviously our skeletal muscle is moving our joints, which moves our body. Okay, so just those are kind of some general things that muscle helps us do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the general histology of muscle. So this is a tissue that's predominantly cells. Okay, remember without the epithelial tissue, that was the truth, right? It was mostly cells, not much extracellular tissue, extracellular space. Connective tissue was the opposite, right? Just a few cells interspersed, but then mostly extracellular space. Skeletal muscle is more like the epithelial tissue in that way, where it's mostly cells. There's not a whole lot of extracellular space. Okay, but it's always going to be kind of intermixed and really interwoven with connective tissue. And you guys have seen this in the cat when you're dissecting. You go from one muscle layer to the next. There's connective tissue in between. There's connective tissue even within the muscles that you're looking at. Okay, all of the muscle cells start as muscles start as myoblasts. Okay, again, myo is going to be referring to muscle. Blast is referring to buds or sending proteins out to create something. Okay, and we can see the three types of muscle here: cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and smooth muscle. Okay. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about each of these, but then spend a little bit more time talking about skeletal muscle. Okay, so let's talk about smooth muscle a little bit. And like I said, the organ systems that we get to next semester, we'll spend more time talking about smooth muscle than we do now. Because we'll talk about smooth muscle a lot in the cardiovascular system. Our arteries have lots of smooth muscle, also in the digestive system. Okay, but the appearance is it's not striated, and that's why it's known as smooth muscle. Okay, striations are like little lines that go down through the muscle cells, and you don't see that in smooth muscle. It's just nice and smooth looking. Okay, it's also what's known as spindle shaped, which those are like little spindles of thread. Okay, but what that means is it's like thicker in the middle, and then it gets down a little more narrow on the ends. Okay, you can see that they're kind of bigger in the middle and then more narrow on both ends of each cell. Okay, smooth muscle has the cells are single nucleated. Okay, there's just one nucleus per cell. Okay, this is going to be controlled involuntarily, right? we can't just think about the muscle in our digestive tract and contract it, right? It's completely involuntarily controlled. Okay, so the primary functions of it: one, it lines our blood vessels; two, it lines our gastrointestinal tract. We definitely have lots of other places too, but these are just kind of two of the big places where we find it. Okay, all right, so that's smooth muscle. Give you one more sec. Okay, and then we've got cardiac muscle. So cardiac muscle is striated. Okay, so you can see those lines in it. Those are the striations. Okay, those striations have to do with something we've already talked about: the sarcomeres inside a muscle. Remember, the sarcomeres are those little functional units inside a muscle. That each of the ends of those is pretty much what we're seeing with these striations, are these kind of dividing points that allow for little sections to shorten within themselves, which ends up shortening the whole cell itself. Okay, these are cylindrical, which just means they're kind of cylinder shaped, long, skinny cylinders, and then they branch too. That's one of the most unique features about cardiac muscle cells, is they branch. All right, so you have one side of this cell just kind of by itself, but then it comes out and branches and connects to two other parts there, right? So it connects to that cell as well as that cell. So that one cell connects to two other cells. Okay, those also have just one single nucleus. And they're obviously also involuntary, right? We can't think about our heart and make it contract more or less. It just does it on its own. That's good. We wouldn't want to be thinking about having to contract our heart all the time, right? So obviously the functions are, number one, just to pump blood. We only find this in our heart. It's the only place in the body that it is. And then also this blood pressure that we have in our body really all starts in the heart by the amount of pressure that the heart creates. Okay, what's another unique feature that's not listed on here about cardiac muscle that we've talked about? Anything else? Gap junctions, there it is. Yeah, that's another important part. So the connections right here between two cells, within those we've got gap junctions. Okay, so that really is just this little hole that allows for an electrical signal or ions to pass from one cell to the next immediately, really quickly. And this allows for when we contract one part of our heart, or when we stimulate one part of our heart, that electrical signal travels all the way down and stimulates the rest of it, so it all can contract at once. Okay. All right, any questions about any of that? Okay, so we got smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and then skeletal muscle. Okay, so this one is also striated. Okay, yeah, and the definition of that is just really just having those lines to it. Just lines throughout. Okay, the shape is cylindrical too, but they're much longer, much bigger cells than what we see in cardiac muscle. And one interesting thing about skeletal muscle is it has multiple nuclei. Okay, so one single muscle cell, I don't have the number on here, we'll get to it in a second, can have thousands and thousands of nuclei within it. And the reason for that is because the cells are just so big. Think about one of those cells in the sartorius, right? The sartorius is the longest muscle in the body. It goes from here all the way down to here. Like we talked about, some of those muscle cells span that whole length, right? So if there's just one nucleus in the top of it up here, it would take forever to get that protein all the way down the other end when we need to add more protein to the other end of the muscle, right? Nerves can do that, right? Neurons can do that. They have special structures to do that. But skeletal muscle comes up with a different way to solve that problem, and it just makes more nuclei. So there's nuclei all throughout. So whenever we need to add proteins to any part of that cell, we can use the nucleus that's closest to that part that needs the protein, instead of having to just have like one central place where all that happens and then passing it down, right? So very large cells. Oops, need proteins all throughout. Okay, so yeah, any questions on that? Go ahead, Trevor. Yeah, absolutely. So around each nucleus, we've also got a rough ER and a Golgi apparatus and all those vesicles and all that stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Mhm. Yeah, that whole endomembrane structure is found all throughout the cell. Yeah, great question. Other questions on it? Okay, so obviously this one's voluntary, unique compared to the other two types of muscle. The movements are mostly things that we would think of, or the functions are mostly things we can think about already, like movement, posture, like we just talked about, joint stability. Okay, we kind of just talked about that one. Right. As a baby is learning to get its posture, right? If you guys have ever taken care of or been around a family member, a little baby, when babies are first born, and even within first month or two of life, they don't even know how to sit up yet, right? You kind of put them up, you try to get into balance, they just kind of fall over, you know. And a lot of that has to do with, yes, making their muscles a little bit stronger, a little bit bigger, but two, probably more importantly, is just the brain's communication with that muscle, getting it to contract at the right level to kind of hold the body in the right position, right? So some of that postural control is definitely about building muscle, but it's also about just knowing how to control that muscle too. So yeah, so it's that. One thing we don't necessarily think about with muscle a lot is heat generation. A really important function of skeletal muscle is when our body gets too cold, it just starts contracting in a really inefficient manner. And so whenever we are trying to use energy to do something like contract a muscle or move something, whatever energy that doesn't actually go to moving our joint is lost as heat, right? That's just like a car. When your car heats up when you burn fuel, because there's only about 20% of the energy in that gasoline that goes to turning your tires. The other 80% is lost as heat, right? And that's just the inefficiency of an engine. We're the same way as humans. We're only about 20 to maybe 30% efficient. So about 70% of what we break down in our chemical energy just is lost as heat, right? So if we make skeletal muscle contract a bunch, and we do it in such a way that is really inefficient, and we can warm ourselves up really quickly, right? And that's exactly what shivering is, right? When we start shivering, we're shaking around, we're doing a really inefficient muscle contraction, and we're losing a lot of heat, but that heat goes into our body and warms us up, right? So it's our best way that we have to warm ourselves up when we get too cold. Okay, so we can increase heat production by 5-fold in a matter of seconds. Okay. All right, any questions on any of that? Okay, so let's take a sec. You guys go ahead and fill in this table just as like a little recap of the 3 types of muscle here, and then we'll come back together. Go ahead. All right. I won't necessarily fill this out myself, but happy to answer any questions that you have on any of this. So any questions about that? Different types of muscle cells. Okay. All right. Well, let's keep moving on then, and now we'll spend the rest of the class diving into skeletal muscle a little bit more. So, yeah. First of all, let's talk a little bit about the cells themselves and what they look like. So, just like I've mentioned before, they're known as fibers. Okay, and they're very, very large cells. So, number one, they're very long. Okay, like we talked about, they can be up to 2 feet or more in a muscle like the sartorius. This bodybuilder image I just like because there's not many times you can actually see somebody's sartorius really well, but this guy you can. Right there it is. you can make it out super clearly the whole way. You can see where it attaches down to the pes anserine. Okay, part of that is because bodybuilders severely dehydrate themselves before competition, right? So their skin just kind of like sucks up to their muscle. Part of it's because it's got really buff muscles too, obviously. but yeah, there's the sartorius. You can even see the vein going over the sartorius too. Yeah, so yeah, some of those muscle cells span that whole length, right? So very, very long. Okay, they're also very thick. Okay, skeletal muscle cells are incredibly thick, not just long, but they're big and thick. They're on average about 10 times the thickness of kind of your general cell, your typical cell in your body. Again, we talked about that connective tissue membrane that surrounds these before, the endomysium, which is a version of that areolar connective tissue. Okay, and the next slide just kind of gives you a little bit of perspective on just how big these cells are compared to a typical cell in the body. So this is a red blood cell, which is by far our most abundant cell type in the body, but it's about average size for a cell in our body. And then you look at an average size skeletal muscle cell right next to it, right? So it's just incredibly large. Compared to that, you can see all those little nuclei sticking out. And that's actually a gross underestimation of how many nuclei there are in skeletal muscle cells. So, and you don't need to memorize these numbers. This is just kind of for fun, because when you're, I just tried to find some actual research articles on this on studies who actually the people actually counted nuclei inside of skeletal muscle cells, and they published it. But I just because we always talk about that like, oh, there's multiple nuclei. I just kind of thought, well, how many actually are there? So of course researchers have thought of that already, and they did studies on this. So for every about millimeter of skeletal muscle, there's somewhere around 40 to 70 nuclei. Okay, so if we talk about one of those big ones that's 2 feet long, that's 600 millimeters, right? So this could mean we have around 33,000 nuclei in a single muscle cell in the sartorius, right? That's a lot, right? When you think of multiple nuclei, you might think, oh, maybe like 5 or 10, like 33,000 nuclei in a single cell, right? So there's a lot of protein production capabilities all throughout that cell, right? All the way from the top of the sartorius to the bottom. And yeah, and that's just one cell, right? And that sartorius has hundreds of thousands of cells within it too, right? So all of those, many of those have many, many nuclei like that. So, okay. All right, so let's talk about some of the special features of the muscle cells, and one of those is what's called the sarcolemma. Okay, so the sarcolemma is just the cell membrane of skeletal muscle. Okay, but it has some special features to it that we don't see in other places in the body. Okay, so the very special part of the sarcolemma is called the motor end plate. And the motor end plate is the specialized region where neurons communicate with the muscle cell. Okay, so we can see that here, right? So this would be the neuron coming in. Okay, that's part of your nervous system coming in. It's going to be able to send signals to that muscle cell, but the spot that neuron interacts with the muscle cell, the membrane there is different. It's folded. It has special receptors on it, what are called acetylcholine receptors. So acetylcholine is the primary neurotransmitter that your muscle cells, or sorry, your motor neurons are going to release to activate that muscle cell. So there's a bunch of acetylcholine receptors in that folded part of the muscle cell membrane. And the more folds we have, then the more of those little receptors we can pack in all along that folded area. Okay. All right, so that's the sarcolemma. The kind of microanatomy of the muscle cells themselves includes some special features as well. One of those is called the T tubules or transverse tubules. Okay, this is actually just part of the membrane. What it is, it's called an invagination of the membrane, which just means it kind of just pokes in a little bit, but it pokes in deep into the muscle cell. Okay, and so the outer membrane kind of pokes in, and it's kind of this in the cylindrical fashion. And what this does is it allows the signal that that neuron sends to the muscle cell to actually interact with the deeper parts of the muscle cell, right? Because that muscle cell is super thick, like we were just looking at, and if the neuron's just interacting with the outside of it, it's going to send a signal on the outside of that cell. But it's if it only stayed on the outside, it wouldn't really get to dive deep, and actually that signal wouldn't have an effect on the deeper parts of the cell. So the membrane goes and dives down deep via these T tubules, and that allows the signal to be spread deep. And we'll talk about why that's important next class when we talk about how we activate a muscle cell. But one of the important parts is we have to stimulate it to release calcium on the inside. And so we need to get that signal to the deeper parts of it. And that's what the T tubules let us do. Sarcoplasmic reticulum is connected to that. So this is a modified version of the endoplasmic reticulum that we find in muscle cell. And its primary role here is to release calcium into the kind of just open part of the muscle cell. Okay, we're gonna see why that is, but the sarcoplasmic reticulum is connected directly to those T tubules, so that signal that's sent along the membrane can go down the T tubules, activate the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then it is going to release calcium on the inside. Okay, and the multinucleated, we kind of already talked about this here. Okay, so take a second here and just this is kind of a cross section, kind of open look at the inside of a muscle cell. So take a look at that, label those different things, and then on your clickers, you can answer this question here. Okay, go ahead, do that with the people on your team.
Yeah, like those box. Yeah, mitochondria. Yeah. This is that's the circle lemma, but I don't see it. Oh, I see. Wait, so this is yeah, the track, and then what is it?
All right, so you're sending in the answer there, the clickers. Which one is responsible for storing and releasing calcium into the muscle cell? All right, a couple more people, I think. All right, okay, see what you guys said. So yeah, most of you are saying B, some of you are saying C, So yeah, let's take a look at each of these structures here. So what would A be? Yeah, so the nucleus there, okay. And then B, what's that called? Yeah, so sarcoplasmic reticulum, okay. And then C, what are those? Mitochondria, yep. And then skeletal muscle, we have a lot of mitochondria, okay. And then D, what's that pointing to? Yeah, just the membrane there. So this is the sarcolemma. And then finally E. E is kind of part of the membrane, but it's those parts that poke in deep. Those are called T-tubules, yeah. And this is kind of gives you a good idea. So the idea, and we'll talk more about this next time, but we get what's called an action potential on a muscle cell membrane. And that's really the signal that the nervous system uses to activate things and to communicate with neuron to neuron. And so if we get an action potential going down this membrane, if it doesn't have a chance to dive in deeply, then it's not going to do anything. It's not going to be able to activate these sarcoplasmic reticulums in here. It's only going to be able to interact with that one, right? So these T-tubules are important because it allows that action potential to travel down, activate this one, travel down, activate this one. And so that's really why those T-tubules are so important. Okay, any questions on any of that? Okay. All right, so just go ahead and just do a little review of this because we've done this before. But go ahead and just remind yourself of this and touch base with the people on your team, and then go ahead and vote on this when you're ready. Fill in the names of those different structures there.
Oh, no, my fiber. Yeah, this is the thing. This is a section. Yeah. And you get been sick for so long, but like right now, I'm feeling not sick.
All right, so you're just sending in the letter there. Which one's the actual muscle cell?
Like, am I smarter? Girl? I think so.
All right, I think about 3 more you need to send it in. Anybody else? Yeah. Nobody else? A couple more people? Okay, that looks better. Good. Okay, so which one's a muscle cell? Almost all of you are saying C. Okay, so that's good. So A is obviously just the muscle. Okay, what do we call B? Fascicle. Okay, C is the muscle cell. What do we call D? Myofibril. Right, myofibril. And then what do we call E? Sarcomere. Okay. So what we'll do next is we'll kind of dive into that sarcomere a little bit deeper, and we'll look at what some of those protein names are on the inside. Yeah, questions on any of that before we keep going? All right, so let's take a look at the sarcomere. So the sarcomere is kind of just categorized by one Z disc to the next. Okay, so a Z disc is this little spot right here. Like I said, this is part of what creates those striations when you look at a muscle cell under a microscope, kind of these dark lines that go through, okay? And so from here to here is one sarcomere, but then we've got a bunch of them all throughout, all right? And so it's made up of a bunch of what are known as myofilaments, all right? And so the myofilaments are a bunch of proteins, really, okay? And the Z lines or Z discs are pretty much the anchor points for these myofilament, just something for them to be bound to tightly. So when these things start pulling on each other, the whole muscle doesn't just fall apart. It has kind of this strong anchor point to pull on. Okay, so let's look at those myofilaments. All right, so here's a list of a bunch of proteins that we find inside of skeletal muscle that are all really important for its function. Okay, so number one is called myosin. Myosin, also known as the thick filament. It has this tail portion that's kind of all bundled into ropes, but then it has these little heads that stick up, and the heads stick up, and they're going to be able to attach to actin and actually cause the whole muscle to shorten. Okay, so actin is known as the thin filament. It's a bunch of little globular proteins all strung together like beads. Okay, and this is really the thing that actually slides. Next class, we'll talk about the sliding filament theory, which is kind of the model for how muscle cells contract. And the actin is actually the one that does the sliding. Okay, but it's the myosin heads that pull it and make it slide. Okay, troponin is another important protein. Its main function that we'll talk about is it has a binding site for calcium on it. Okay, and when calcium binds to it, it completely changes its shape, which is going to be important in the function of contraction. Okay, tropomyosin is another one that we'll talk about, and that one kind of winds around actin. And one of its it's really its major role that we'll talk about is that it's pretty much just in the way for that myosin head to contract to bind to actin. Okay, it just kind of gets in the way, and so we have to have a mechanism to push it out of the way before that myosin head can bind to actin. Okay, and then lastly, titin. Titin is a protein. It's known as the largest protein ever discovered. It contains right around 30,000 amino acids in its chain, and it's really the elastic component of muscle. So it can stretch, and then it can kind of bounce back. It has this kind of spring shape to it, and so it gives a lot of that elasticity that I was talking about. When you stretch out muscle and wants to bounce back, a lot of that is because titin has that is very elastic. Okay, so take a second and fill in which one is which here with the myofilaments, and then you can answer that question on your clicker. Which one is myosin?
Oh, wait, the whole thing is. Oh, this whole thing is. Like this right here is. Oh.
All right, so a few more of you, go ahead and send that in. We need about three more people. All right, anybody else? One more person, I think. Make sure you send it in. There we go. Good. Okay, so good. 100% of you said that C is myosin, so that's got to be correct. All right, what about A? That's probably the only one that's not super duper obvious, but you probably use the process of elimination. What's that one? Troponin. Okay, that's where calcium is going to bind to. B is the one that's kind of hiding the binding site between actin and myosin. So what's that one called? Tropomyosin. Okay, and then C, what's that one? Myosin, we already said that. And then D, the one that's kind of shaped like a spring. Titin. And then E, actin. Good. Okay, and we'll talk more next time about how those things actually work to create muscle contraction. One thing real quick is is that we tend to see sarcomeres in 2D because that's what our textbooks are, is 2D, right? We see one myosin, an actin, and an actin. That's not how our bodies are never 2D, right? They're always 3D. So it probably looks something more like this, right? Where we have multiple actins surrounding that one myosin, usually something like 6 actins around each myosin. So the myosin heads are coming in off in all angles, pulling from all angles. So that's it, guys. Have a great rest of your day. Don't get too wet.
Is it raining right now?
No, I don't know. You can do it.
Like, how does he get it? That you say. Underage, I don't know.